between accommodation and contestation. Brazil in the calculation of U.S. power for Latin America. Brazil is the key state for maintaining or contesting U.S. power on the American continent. As the third largest economy and third largest territory in the Americas, behind only the United States and Canada, and as the second largest population and second largest army in the region, Brazil has undeniable weight for the configuration of forces at the continental level. First of all, it is necessary to mention that the thesis of the key state, popularized by Oscar Camillón, former Minister of Defense of Argentina between 1993 and 1996, proclaimed that the United States delegated the mission of maintaining the order and political stability for a given key country in each region of the globe. The intention was to use a selected regional power to play the role of defender of the Pax Americana, and with this, keep the hegemony of the United States intact at the local and global levels. According to this interpretation, in Europe, the key country chosen by the United States was Germany, militarily occupied and which played an important role in the European integration project. In Asia, Washington's main partner is Japan, which is also home to US military bases and troops and serves as an important buffer against Chinese power. In the Middle East, that country is Israel, with which Americans have a special relationship due to the strong Israeli lobby and presence in the United States. And finally, in Latin America, following this same reading, the key country for Americans is precisely Brazil. Indeed, there were moments in Brazil's history when its Latin American neighbors had the perception that the country was being used as an instrument to achieve North American objectives on the continent. In this sense, one can cite, for example, the first years of the military regime, especially under the leadership of Castelo Branco, in which Brazil temporarily set aside its attempts to exercise a more independent and multifaceted foreign policy. At the time, the Brazilian government preferred to give priority to the issue of collective security in the Americas, automatically and ideologically aligning itself with the United States in the context of the Cold War, representing Washington's interests in Latin America. Such subordination was expressed within a concentric logic, in which Brazilian interests were defined primarily based on the vision of the Americans for the continent. It is exactly during this period that, for example, the political rupture with Cuba took place. The participation of Brazilian troops in the military intervention led by the United States in the Dominican Republic in 1965 and the idea of creating an inter-American peacekeeping force to police the space ideology in Latin America. Even if this initial position of accommodation by the military regime later changed, it did not take long for this type of movement to be reproduced in Brazil a few years after its redemocratization. This is because, with the end of the Cold War and the disappearance of the bipolarity in the system, the brief government of Fernando Collor introduced into the domestic political plan the idea that Brazil had no other option but to align itself with the hegemonic power, accepting without resistance the economic and ideological directives emanating from Washington. Following the example of Brazil, therefore, other countries in the region ended up adopting the so-called Washington Consensus, which was a broad economic program with a liberal bias that was intended to promote the recovery of the continent. Elaborated by economists and representatives of the U.S. government, the result of the adoption of these programs in Latin America was highly troubled, generating serious economic crises and dissatisfaction on the part of the civil population and even the political elites in the region. It represented, in short, a time of accommodation for Brazil towards the new phase of U.S. economic imperialism in the world. In more recent times, in turn, the government of Jair Bolsonaro has also given rise to the interpretation that the USA and Brazil were once again aligning themselves almost automatically with the interests of the United States in the American continent. This is because the country had once again set aside part of its multi-vector foreign policy, preferring to establish closer bilateral contacts with states such as Israel, Japan, and the United States itself. However, Brazil began to challenge the importance of multilateralism and international organizations such as the UN, mimicking the speech of US President Donald Trump. Furthermore, the Bolsonaro administration removed Brazil from the CELAC, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, framework in 2020. It is worth remembering that CELAC was created with the aim of strengthening regional integration initiatives, without the participation of the United States and Canada, precisely seeking to consolidate Latin America as an independent political pole and as one of the centers of influence in the multipolar world. Therefore, repeating behaviors from its past, some of the actions adopted by the Bolsonaro government indicated a regional disengagement from Brazil, once again demonstrating relative accommodation with the guidelines and interests of the United States in the continent. However, this Brazilian foreign policy did not remain monolithic for long, and reversals and changes in course ended up manifesting themselves at the end of his mandate. With the absence of Trump in the White House, the Brazilian president moved towards a relative reapproximation with the BRICS countries and with Russia in particular. Faced with this new scenario, Bolsonaro, despite Washington's displeasure, ended up visiting Moscow in February 2022, even mentioning that he showed solidarity with Russia, thus going against American interests at the time. Later, when the Kremlin chose to start the special military operation in Ukraine, the Bolsonaro government decided not to follow the United States, avoiding the use of sanctions against Russia. Following the same final line of the Bolsonaro administration, the current Brazilian government, headed by Lula, also preferred to continue a path of careful contestation of the role of the United States in international relations. Additionally, such contestation involved the expansion of regional economic and political cooperation ties in Latin America, as well as with the Global South, through the BRICS and the G20. Such movements, in turn, start from the perception that the current situation of the system requires the joint defense by Latin American countries of their national interests, and that this defense must count on the leadership of Brazil. Together with this, other important phenomena can be seen, such as the interest of several countries in the region in joining the BRICS group, such as Argentina, Uruguay, Venezuela, Mexico, Cuba, etc. Initial discussion on the need to promote trade, bilateral exchange in local currencies, maintaining regional neutrality in the face of the conflict in Ukraine, signing economic and technological agreements with China, etc. All these movements, without a shadow of a doubt, represent, to a greater or lesser extent, a challenge to American power on the continent. Finally, it is curious to note that in 1970, the then American President Richard Nixon said that wherever Brazil goes, Latin America will also go. There are reasons to believe that Nixon was right. After all, Brazil's size and resources naturally entitle it to a role of influence and regional leadership. However, it will be up to Brazil alone to define what to do with this influence, whether it will use it to accommodate itself or to challenge the hegemonic power of the United States on the continent. One more news. Lavrov says if F-16s fly over Ukraine and create threat to Russia, there will be military technical response. In an interview with RT at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Spieth, the Russian foreign minister, commented on the situation regarding Ukraine. Russia, as an integral part of the United Nations Security Council, whose member states possess nuclear weapons, has expressed a strong protest to the U.S. over plans to supply Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets, capable of carrying nuclear payloads, it said on Friday. Fair Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. Now, there is talk of F-16s, which can indeed be equipped to carry nuclear weapons. We have already said this publicly. Furthermore, within the framework of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, there is such a nuclear quintet where specialists periodically gather. We express a very serious protest there in this regard, Lavrov told in an interview with RT. The Americans tried to deny it and say, "Do you really think we're going to give Ukraine planes that will carry nuclear weapons?" And we told them that we haven't even thought about that. Equipped with nuclear weapons, then one that carries nuclear weapons, then one that carries nuclear weapons, warned Lavrov on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. SPEEF. According to the Russian foreign minister, the answer depends on the military. They know what to do. The F-16 is a military technical product, so if we realize that these planes flew over Ukraine and pose a threat to us, of course that too, there will be a technical military response. Russia's foreign minister has made it clear that she will be obliged to ensure her own security. He said that the very war unleashed against us is a geopolitical war. For him, the outcome of this situation can only be in view of the fact that it is a geopolitical conflict. So resolving it will mean, among other things, the need to resolve the problem of security guarantees. We will not be ready to create these guarantees based on one more promise or even some documents that the West can offer. We ourselves must guarantee our own security, underlined Sergei Lavrov. He also spoke about the pressure of Western countries against the Persian Gulf states on Russia. There is pressure, but the fact that virtually none of the world's majority states in the global south have adhered to sanctions shows that attempts at pressure are not working. Lavrov replied when asked if he noticed examples of U.S. and Western pressure on the Persian Gulf countries on the issue. One more news. New messages show the armed forces pressuring Mauro Cid to convince Bolsonaro of a coup. Last week, messages surfaced on the cell phone of Jair Bolsonaro's former assistant, Mauro Cid, which highlighted the attempted coup d'etat promoted by the former president's surroundings to keep him in power after his defeat at the polls. This Friday, new documents and messages were published by Veja magazine and show not only that the coup attempt was encouraged, but also that pressure was exerted by members of the armed forces to convince the former president to continue with the action, as well as the development of a roadmap for this. Mauro Cid, who has been imprisoned since the beginning of May, was authorized yesterday by Minister Alexandre de Moraes to give testimony at the CEPI of the Senate that investigates the invasions of the buildings of the three powers in Brasilia, according to Agência Brasilia. Army Commander Barr's job in U.S. for colonel suspected of plotting coup with Mauro Cid. After new messages on the cell phone of Bolsonaro's former assistant, the Army barred the appointment of the former Deputy Chief of Staff for a position in the United States. Defense of the former president denied this afternoon any involvement of him in the articulation for the coup d'etat. With the dialogues exchanged between Cid and Colonel Jean Lawan Jr., the Army commander, General Thomas Paiva, decided not to send the colonel to the diplomatic representation of Brazil in the United States in Washington. According to the newspaper O Globo, the decision was taken at a meeting between Thomas Paiva, the Minister of Defense, José Muccio Monteiro, and President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva at the Alvorada Palace this Friday. The conversation lasted about an hour and a half. In Thomas's assessment, the colonel should stay in the country to provide the necessary explanations to all questions that arise about the case. According to the force, Jean Lawan will remain in Brazil in the Strategic Projects Office of the General Staff of the Army, reports the media. In audios sent to Cid, the colonel pressures the former aide to convince Bolsonaro to go ahead with the coup d'etat, or the former president would be arrested. Cid, for the love of God, the man Bolsonaro has to give the order. If the top of the Brazilian army is not with him, from the division down, he is. Advise and give him courage. Read one of the messages. Also this afternoon, Jair Bolsonaro's defense issued a note and said that he never participated in any conversation about an alleged coup d'etat. At the same time, the defense stated that the then assistant, due to the function performed, received the demands, scheduling requests, messages, among others. That should come to the attention of the former president, and that on several occasions he became in a simple mailbox that recorded the most diverse lamentations, according to the statement released by UOL. In addition to the messages exchanged with the colonel, the federal police also found on Cid's cell phone a script for the coup d'etat with 3 pages, entitled Armed Forces as a Moderating Power, with step-by-step instructions indicating how a coup should be carried out within the 4 lines of the Constitution. According to the text itself, one more news: European Union to ban Huawei and ZTE from participating in its 5G networks, says European Commissioner. Thierry Breton, Commissioner for the European Union's internal market, criticized most member states for not taking meaningful action against Chinese companies. The European Commission will ban China's Huawei and ZTE from its 5G telecommunications networks. In line with recommendations adopted 3 years ago, the European Union's Commissioner for the Internal Market said on Thursday. The European Union adopted a cybersecurity toolbox in 2020 that defined 5G technology providers who are subject to highly intrusive third-party laws on national intelligence and data security as being high risk. The Commission will implement the principles of the 5G toolbox in its own procurement of telecom services to avoid exposure to Huawei and ZTE. Thierry Breton said in a statement. He chided EU member states for moving too slowly to restrict or ban Chinese technology providers from key parts of their telecommunications networks. So far, he said, only 10 of the 27 EU member states have restricted or banned Huawei and ZTE. This is too slow and poses a huge security risk and exposes the collective security of the Union as it creates a huge dependency for the EU and serious vulnerabilities. Breton said. The Commissioner for the Internal Market said the rest of the bloc must act without further delay and deal with what he described as critical dependencies that pose a risk to the common security of the bloc's countries.